So in my contribution today, I want to present some of the findings of the projects that I've been working on with colleagues at Compass as part here at Oxford as part of the Oxford Future of Cities programme. A project entitled Global Migration and the Future of the Right to the City. The project explored the impact of global migration on contemporary urbanism. Our research questions were around how the age of migration reconfigures the relationship between the global, the national and the urban, about what the ethical and practical challenges emerging from this are, especially for competition for an allocation of resources in the city, and thirdly, how can the cities of the future respond to these challenges. We conducted pilot fieldwork in London and Birmingham, focusing on the competing ethical claims made on entitlements and obligations to urban social goods, including housing. And we also conducted study visits to European cities, Istanbul, Athens, Turin, and Barcelona, to explore the possibility of developing kind of comparative research agenda in this area. And then following from that, we developed more in-depth ethnographic work in 3 South London neighbourhoods, Camberwell, Bermondsey, and starting most recently, Elephant and Castle, all in inner South London. And we collaborated with colleagues over the last 2 years in other cities working on parallel projects in Turin, Barcelona and some other cities. In the UK pilot fieldwork, we conducted research in 2 areas. As I said, one case study led by my colleague Haranthi Jayawira explored the impact of global migration on entitlements concerning health in Britain's second metropolis, Birmingham. And a second case study, which I led, explored the impact of global migration on entitlements to housing in London, with inner city sites in the London Borough of Southwark, Elephant and Castle, Camberwell and Bermondsey, and outer city sites in Lewisham, as well as a kind of peri-urban site in West Kent, St Mary's Estate in Swanley, which included participant observation, interviews with housing professionals and with tenant activists. And in both case studies, we found that practitioners and local policymakers are struggling with outdated intelligence on their populations, as well as changing targets related to changing national policies, and that this impedes the possibility of visible social justice, of transparency in ethical debates around the allocation of social goods in the city. Conflict over these goods, particularly in the case of housing, is overcoded with xenophobic attitudes and a politics of resentment, as claims based on belonging, local belonging, are used to exclude migrants' claims based on universal need. However, socioeconomic cleavages also related to positions in the housing market were in many cases more significant than these kind of ethnic and migration-related cleavages. And we also found strong narratives of tolerance and an ethics of hospitality alongside these xenophobic discourses. In the European fieldwork, which I conducted partly with Michael Keith, we met with migration scholars, city planners and urban activists, working in neighbourhoods that are key to frontier zones for migrant residents or gentrification or both. And at this point I'll apologise for my appalling pronunciation of the other languages which I use. Barriere de Milano and San Salvario in Turin, Cumcapi, Zeytinburnu and Fenerbahçe in Istanbul, Raval and Poblisek in Barcelona, and Agios Panteleimonos in Athens. We found significant resonances across these different sites in terms of demographic and property trends, in terms of conflicts between old residents and new migrants, but also others such as gentrifiers, and competing rights claims to urban social goods. But the nature of urban diversity is itself highly heterogeneous across these spaces, experienced and defined in radically different ways in different parts of Europe. The range of possibilities at ground level is partly structured by powerful structural and particularly socioeconomic factors, but also by more contingent factors, such as the texture of the urban fabric, the political economy of real estate at a local level, the thickness of civil society, and residents' own tactics, narratives and memories. And in particular, the texture of urban space in its various forms, as well as city and even neighbourhood-specific narratives on diversity, including different ways of claiming the right to the city, create different possibilities for and barriers to cohesion, conviviality and resilience across Europe's cities, although we can identify patterns that recur across cities. Europe's new diversity has created new economic and cultural opportunities, but also challenges as cities and city dwellers find ways to live together. Some cities and neighbourhoods have shown remarkable cohesion, openness and resilience, and thus been able to harness what's often called the diversity advantage, while others have not. Academic research has sometimes been unable to fully account for such processes and for what makes diversity work for a city. because of the different biases and blindnesses built into the disciplinary silos that academics work within. And in particular, scholars have not grasped the complex and messy ways the different scales, street, neighbourhood, city, region, nation, continent, relate to each other. Parochial views from particular corners of Europe have limited the analytical models that urbanists have had to work with in thinking about this. Historically shallow accounts have ignored the complex histories and sometimes active and sometimes repressed memories of migration and diversity, which have given shape to the contemporary European city. And we need, therefore, to understand the interplay of different geographical and historical registers of belonging, different regimes of rights, responsibilities, and citizenship. So to illustrate this, I guess probably a little superficially in the time that I have, in the remainder of my contribution today, I'm going to focus on the politics arising from these new geographies of diversity and new cartographies of exclusion, looking in particular at inner city arrival neighbourhoods. In the classic Burgess model, which we've already seen today, of Chicago's concentric circle, the arrival zones of cities are typically in that kind of zone of transition just outside the central business district. And in these areas, during periods of relative economic vibrancy, gentrification and regeneration often squeeze the precarious footholds established by migrants, while in periods of economic squeeze, harsh competition for scarce urban resources becomes interwoven with the question of who has the right to stake a claim in the neighbourhood. The most dramatic case of this sort of politics can be seen in Athens and is illustrated in the rise of Golden Dawn. The peculiar history of Athens' urban development, a variation of what has been called the Southern European urban model based on kind of rapid, deregulated urban development in the post-war years, has meant that large parts of the inner city have private sector housing affordable to very low-income migrants, which in turn has led to rapid demographic change in the last 2 decades. Whereas similar demographic changes have created migrant districts in many European cities, in Athens the dominant spatial settlement has often been one of vertical segregation, with native ethnic Greeks, often from the families of original freeholders, occupying upper floors of low-rises and migrants in lower floors. And this kind of vertical segregation is kind of common in other southern European cities. In Turin it's the other way around, with the kind of cramped upper floors of some central districts being inhabited previously by southern Italian labour migrants, more recently by international migrants. So Athens' demographic change has fed a kind of politics of resentment in some neighbourhoods, expressed, for example, in the proliferation of Greek flags flying from the balconies of those upper floors as a marker of the right to the neighbourhood, as well as by popular discourses of abandonment by the municipal state. This resentment has been mobilised, as you're probably all aware, by the far right. The fascist Golden Dawn used one such neighbourhood, Agios Panteleimonos, as their springboard to the citywide and national political stage. Golden Dawn led residents in performatively occupying a small square outside the church, the neighbourhood church that had been used by migrants as a kind of safe space for recreation. And its activists had some popular support in acting as vigilantes to defend the neighbourhoods from migrant bodily presence on the streets around it. Interestingly, as Golden Dawn support spread until recently throughout the city, it's declined in this neighbourhood as the kind of micro-local discourse no longer saw it as defending this kind of place-specific interest, but rather as another player on a corrupt political stage. So this is the church square that says foreigners out, Greece for the Greeks. So kind of staking a claim to the literal space of the city. Typically in European cities, the ebb tides of previous property booms and regeneration efforts create interstices or gaps, huecos, as Magriña Toné and Marcel Couturiers put it in their account of Barcelona, with affordable private rented housing and micro-work units conducive to migrant settlement. However, during times of recovery and boom, in the flood tide of property speculation, such gaps become attractive sites for development. Sometimes diversity or multiculturalism as exotic local colour for external consumption, for instance ethnic food, can be part of an area's asset for developers to curate and capitalise on. At other times, the association between migrant bodies and deviants poses an obstacle to realising land values. The severity of the economic crisis in Athens has meant that these dynamics are less apparent there than in, for example, Istanbul, London or Barcelona. And Istanbul, some of the work that Ebru has done looks at this issue. These kinds of politics can create complex alliances and tensions between different political subjects in the city, exposing the constantly shifting configurations of the established and the outsiders, to use Laos's terms, in urban space. So in Alfama in Lisbon, for example, struggles against gentrification under the slogan "No to Extinction" have sought to include migrant and Roma residents mobilised alongside white ethnic Portuguese in the name of the povo, the people, against municipal plans that seek to draw the tourist and cultural economy into the neighbourhood. So here both natives and outsiders are constructed as ethnically diverse. Or similarly in Bermondsey in South London, a powerful discourse of micro-local belonging has meant that the front line between established working class residents and new wealthy residents in gated roadside developments was noted more sharply by our research participants than the more well-known ethnic boundaries. In Raval, in Barcelona, the first wave of regeneration and gentrification had seen the official neighbourhood association, the Associação de Veïns de Raval, endorsing municipal plans, leading to the emergence of a short-lived alternative resistant association, Quartal de Raval, which sought to engage the migrant population. And in the current century, during the period of economic growth, in which the city's property market boomed, Catalan and Spanish residents, both lower middle-class established residents and wealthy and new residents, have organised plataformas de vecinos, neighbourhood platforms, under the Catalan slogan "Volem un barri digne," we want a dignified neighbourhood. These have mobilised against behaviour seen as antisocial, often associated with migrants, including prostitution, begging, and certain types of street hawking. It's fuera lateros, kind of tinkers out, signifying a strong claim on neighbourhood space. And some of the plataformas have actively occupied space using the tactic of the cacerolada, literally casserole, kind of pot banging demonstration which you can participate in without leaving your flat, to challenge local youths, including those of migrant origin, involved in drug dealing. But these plataformas have also mobilised against some gentrifying private developments and some of the municipality's top-down regeneration plans, whereas many migrant associations and entrepreneurs, on the other hand, including some with deep roots in the area, are involved in the non-governmental foundation that works in close partnership with the municipality in driving forward these regeneration plans, giving them a kind of image of popular legitimacy and claim to speak for the area's diversity, which proposes in a different way the question of who counts as an insider and who counts as an outsider. And then finally, in Barcelona, more politically radical urban activists have challenged both the official plans and the plataforma's discourse. So this take the same slogans and kind of detourn them, I guess. So we want an indignant barrier rather than we want a dignified one. But the language in which these anti-gentrification discourse is articulated around protecting an authentic neighbourhood from invasion, from cleansing, echo exactly the rhetoric of indigeneity and insiderism used in xenophobic mobilisations. Competition for access to the welfare state, and including to social housing, has typically been expressed in exactly these sorts of terms too, intersecting with shifting established outsider configurations. The nature of the welfare state, settlement and kind of difference from country to country is therefore crucial to the possibility of different forms of cohabitation. In Athens, for example, the highly residualised welfare state and the absence of public housing, relative absence of public housing, has meant that natives rely on similar informal strategies to migrants, often family-based, with these informal arrangements made more precarious by economic restructuring and austerity, pushing households and neighbourhoods like the one looked at before towards alternative sources of collective consumption and social solidarity, such as those provided by Golden Dawn. In London, in contrast, this is my final example, more extensive but tightly rationed social housing creates a very different situation. In areas like Bermondsey in inner London, or Barking in outer London, or Swanley in the far suburbs, the landscape is dominated by social housing, and demographic change is perceived in terms of outsiders accessing a public resource, with mainstream politicians and media framing this in terms of migrants jumping the queue for housing. Some established residents in everyday discourse express a belief that their neighbourhood has been invaded. And in our focus groups in the area, white working class residents spoke of public services as always being provided for other people, migrants and ethnic minorities, and never for the likes of us. A militantly particularist local nationalism is expressed spatially in Bermondsey by the ubiquitous English St George's flag flying from council flat balconies, analogous to the Greek flags on the upper floors in Athens, and is widely locally believed that the municipalities actually banned this flag as racist. Housing politics have consequently been one of the main platforms of the electoral appeal of the far right, particularly the British National Party, BNP, in such areas in the last decade or so. They won municipal seats in Barking and in Swanley, for example. Les Back and Roger Hewitt have described how, under the slogan of rights for rights, the BNP appropriated multiculturalist politics of recognition to demand resources for a native population increasingly perceiving itself as a minority, mobilising the politics of resentment expressed in the likes of us discourse. However, digging deeper in Bermondsey, we found alternative narratives that confounded this story. One white working class market trader who used highly xenophobic language in our focus group and interviews also told us of how market traders had come together to physically eject BNP activists from the market and from the neighbourhood. The first Rights for Whites marches went through Bermondsey, and they'd seen it as a kind of abuse of their neighbourhood. The fierce militant particularism, neighbourhood nationalism of the area, while resentful of middle class discourses which stigmatised it as racist, saw the BNP too as outsiders with no place in the community. Similarly, in our ethnographic work in the area, we saw white British residents who articulated again highly xenophobic sentiments in interviews, engaged in mundane practices of deeply meaningful inter-ethnic cohabitation, with white native and migrant neighbours lending and borrowing money to each other, sharing childcare, doing each other's shopping, forms of intimacy and trust that add up to a fragile but valuable everyday conviviality cutting against the grain of the kind of publicly expressed local discourse of xenophobia, which I think might offer us some cause for hope for the possibility of living together in the city.
Thank you very much, Ben.
Good afternoon. I would like to thank the organizer of this symposium for inviting me to be with you here, and I am glad to be in Oxford. I would like to present a very short presentation about living with or living in Ashwayat in Egypt. I am asking, is it a new innovation of urbanity in several countries? Here, Egypt now witness a dramatic alteration of the urban morphology of the Egyptian cities, where housing informality or Ashwayat. Ashwayat, we call it, it is legal housing development built in agricultural land. It has become the dominant feature of Egyptian landscape. There is a significant literature on informal housing, but I wouldn't go through it. I will stress in two arguments. The emerging urbanization of housing informality or Ashwayat has been informally locked into invisible, visible urban enclaves within the built environment. The second point, everyday struggle of the urban poor in their own cities and other cities is examined to understand how they create a cultural struggle to formulate their own environment and how they perform within urban life. It assumes that Ashwayat has created a new pattern with the specific life and physical style with the urban environment. Here we can see how Ashwayat is spreading all over the periphery of Egyptian cities and the composition and urban fabric of Ashwayat around the Egyptian cities. Housing development in Egypt occurs within both formal and informal, and both linked with informal and formal market. I would like to give you some figures about the housing situation there in Egypt. You can imagine between 1982 and 2004, an estimated 1.2 million faddan has been disseminated through housing informality. One faddan is equal 0.4 hectares. If this trend continue, Egypt will lose all its agricultural land, around 5 million faddans, within only 200 years. You can imagine all Egypt will be full of housing, and the rest is desert. Second point is 2006, the total number of housing units in urban area reaches 14.2 million units. This is equivalent to almost double the number of urban households, around 7.8, which resulted in housing surplus of 6.4 million housing units. In 2007, there were an estimated 8.5 million informal housing units, making around 60% of housing stock. 2013, the total population of Egypt approaches a figure of 91 million, and it is expected to reach 151 million by 2050, where 62.4% will be urbanized. That means we need at least 2/3 of current urban fabric to be added within 30 years only on existing population. As a result of the flourishing of urban informality in Egyptian cities, social exclusion and diversity in urban settings have emerged. Here you can imagine how we have a housing puzzle in Egypt. We've got a surplus of housing unit, and at the same time we've got a problem in housing to accommodate the urban poor. It is a big puzzle in Egyptian situation. Really, you can notice here the urban fabric of informal housing. This morning session, there is many discussion about urbanization, but I would like to stress on the Cairo School for Urban Studies, committed to fusing political economy to reveal the new contours and the patterns of modern power emerging in the urban frame. This is a new school really in American University in Cairo. They started to link between political economy and urban informality. However, the process of urbanization, once viewed simply as inevitable consequences of developmental change, is now seen as an integral component and the generator of economic growth, political change, information technology, and social transformation. The problem is, despite all above views, how do they affect the urban poor? No school of urbanization taking into their consideration the urban poor, who formulate at least between 40 to 45% of the total population of any city in Cairo. So the changes that have occurred following the process of globalization and urbanization have increased the relevance of social exclusion and sharply affected the urban poor obtaining goods and services in their own cities. Major cities in Egypt have become a loci of contest space with growing number of marginalized people who are now claiming the right to the city as well. These places are not marked on city maps and are categorized by the majority as illegal or shuwayyat, and became the signifiers of the socially constructed and demonized image of the other. These communities are all the result of labor exploitation, poverty, and socio-economic exclusion that have pushed people to act illegally and claim the right to the city, and even more excluded a whole city. Informality offers a relevant entry point to explore urban divide into city inequality. Here, I would like to move the big question: who rules the street in Cairo now, or in Egyptian cities? I think the residents who built it, because now every person wants to have a shelter. So they formulate their own urban fabric, not the state. They are formulating the new fabric. But it most of Egyptian cities, it became visible to recognize Shuriyat in the periphery of the major urban center, and it formalized a palette of poverty around all Egyptian cities. All Egyptian cities now surrounding with a palette of informality, as we will see later. The result is a growing diversion in Egyptian cities between the new, the old, and the haphazard part of the urban agglomeration, a great divide between establishing, struggling, and emerging urban spaces. The former space is the new gated communities of the elite of the society. The middle is the formal city and symbolizes the communities that follows for prevailing law, whereas the latter is Shwayat and mirrors the urban poor. Shwayat reflects a conjunction of conditions linked with urban poverty, violence, migrants, concentration, and it is especially expressed in feasible and infeasible urban enclaves. And these enclaves have changed the Egyptian morphology and became visible in the spaces they occupy and inhabit. The failure of the government, urban land and housing policy, and the inability of the former public sector to provide land for housing the poor have strengthened the appeal of informal land markets and amplified social exclusion with the urban areas. Here, شويات is the output of four main reasons. Egypt institution framework has faced financial planning and urban governance limitation. Citizens in Ashwat now identify with this kind of institution shifting power, asking for social justice, as it happened in the last two revolutions. Responsibility and legitimacy away from the central government. Now, every person in Egypt acts as he likes. Nobody can control any person in Egypt. The people processors for Ashwat are increasing home ownership and encouraging integration with informal markets and informal institution mechanisms through the actors who are ruling this process. Ashwat is integrated into an equal urban niches that especially express power relations that are currently estimated from rapid increase in knowledge economy and information technology. The lack of balance between demographic change and urban growth, social segregation, and the absence of a future development policy for achieving the ongoing special changes have major influence in the swelling of Ashwat in Egypt. Here I will try to go through a case study is carried out by GOBP, General Organization for Physical Planning in Cairo, since the last 6 months. Here, before I go through, I would like to mention that most informal area in Cairo are located at the northern and western side of the city. As you can see here, all of these black spots, it is informal, or we can call it Shwayat, surrounding Cairo on the western side and northern side of the city. Evidence indicated that the appearance of urban informalization in Cairo dates back to 1910s, when squatter area were found in the Matariya area northwest of the city of Cairo. Most of the literature review returned back that informality began at the beginning of 60s or beginning of 70s. But it isn't true. It is began in 1990s. That's a very important point to say. Not Shwayat, not it is the outcome of the last 230 years, but it is returned back for more than 100 years in Cairo, especially in Cairo. The remuneration of housing informality on agricultural land in Matariya began to appear in 1920s. Why it is appeared in Matariya? Matariya is close to an area called the Heliopolis, or it used to be a sub-area in Cairo. And people who are working in construction process in the Heliopolis area moved and settled in Matariya and started to formulate informality in this area. All of the Matariya area was agricultural land. It wasn't. Now the total area of Matariya is about, you can imagine, the total area it is 1,600 faddan with a population of 0.8 million people with a very high residential density of more than 500 persons per faddan. Here, if we move to the Matariya area itself, the housing in the Matariya area are integrated with adjacent neighborhood to the name or defined bounds, either physical or social. The Matariya is consisted from several quarters, which are dominated with a main road network with main, secondary, and the back streets. The main streets are the official traffic roads and the only parts of the area of which the better off inhabitants of Cairo or intruders may ever catch a glimpse as they pass through the area. There is a diversity in urban pattern within Matariya area as well. Here, the main streets are a nice area to the really poor compared to their own back streets. At crossroads, there are different traffic jams mixing with microbuses, private cars, and tuk-tuk. The street is the scheme of many different economic and social activities. Arbitrary markets are distributed in the main street, especially at crossroads and in front of metro station. Here you can find different diversity pattern in the Matariya area. Here organic pattern, and here arbitrary pattern, and agricultural land subdivision pattern and organized pattern. Within the Matariya area itself, there is diversity in urban pattern and urban fabric. The Matariya community was often based on family ties and shared background. Physical and socially Ashwayat streets form a special urban pattern. The inner streets themselves are like alleys, often more than 2.5 to 3 meters wide. while the main streets are much wider and accommodate the elite of the community. Most houses are back to back with others which have their front doors facing the next parallel little street. Along both sides of the streets, there are houses standing wall to wall from 12 to 14 to 16 to 20 per block. They are mostly 4 to 7 stories high with 2 3 flats per floor, depending on the size of land plots. The same front door and the stairs are used by all the people living in the house. I will jump into this slide very quickly. Some general differences between the flats seem to be due to their economic and social situation. The rooms are small and dark. The flats are overcrowded, but it is difficult to estimate how much is crowded. Social exclusion and consolidation is not only a product of enforcement by others, it can also be self-determined by the residents themselves. Specific groups may be referred to or isolate themselves in order to protect community political identity and collective consciousness. I would like to go to some conclusion. Ashwayat is not only for housing, but it is a way to formulate and use this in the city within the city. Ashwayat became a matter of capital investment in land, and it has a fundamental importance in the land use own right, and became an issue of social struggle for home ownership and for meeting basic human needs that the state couldn't provide. Ashwayat have created a new urbanity different than the one produced by the state. The differences and diversity within Egyptian society became a major wheel in driving the urban pattern by which Ashwayat became a dominant of urban morphology of Egyptian cities. The last point is some principles need to be taken into consideration. Ashwayat need a comprehensive set of policies or a complete package of policies rather than a piecemeal approach. Ashwayat need to be formulated in line with socio-economic reforms and poverty alleviation strategy with the context of socio-economic needs of the bottom of the pyramid of the society as well as the top of the pyramid of the society. The government has to adopt a policy that supports what people do, what people are willing to do, and to relate to the benefit of the collective resources by which enabling affordable housing standards rather than standards so invisible that leave most of the housing stock unregulated. Throughout the various potentialities and the constraints of Ashwayat, and the fact is that Egypt has been magnified by the political goal of saving and rescuing agricultural land from the perspective of an overall control by the local powers, the passage from a state-driven policy to a society-driven urban development policy has become vital. Here you can imagine how people, how they act and treat the palm tree. They just go, they build their houses and they can stand in the roof and collect some dates. And that is the innovation of the urban boom. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you to all the organisers involved in putting these two great days together. Very exciting couple of days. What I want to do is very quickly destroy the podium. Very quickly, stop doing that. Very quickly review some ideas around everyday life that I've been exploring just lately in relation to a project on sanitation. Which is based in 2 informal settlements in Mumbai. So I want to start with a question which has been on my mind just lately. What is the political, what is the urban political when there is nowhere to shit? I think this is a fundamental question for contemporary urban studies. If it's true that the world is urbanising at a faster rate than it's done before, if it's true that that is happening generally in the global south, and if it's true that that's happening generally in informal settlements or slums, then the question of where to shit and how you get there is increasingly politicised and should be therefore a question on our radar, perhaps ever slightly more centrally than it has been hitherto. Mumbai is one of the biggest cities in the world, as many of you know. The project explores two different neighbourhoods. One here in the west of Mumbai called Kotwadi, which is a legalised neighbourhood. It's a neighbourhood which has very close links to the dominant political party in Mumbai, a party called the Shiv Sena, which is a Hindu fundamentalist, anti-Muslim, ethno-chauvinist, regionalist party. Any negative adjective you can place in front of the Shiv Sena and you're not far wrong. One of the dominant political parties in the city. So being in Kotwadi, the links to the Shiv Sena are important for the provision of services to that informal settlement. And the second neighbourhood is Rafinagar, which is just a few miles away. Kotwadi is here, Rafinagar is here. Right up against the edge of the city's mangroves, built on the edge of the largest municipal dumping ground in India, Durham. This question of what do you do when you have nowhere to shit, came to the fore very sharply in Mumbai, in Rafinagar, in 2011. Rafinagar is both illegal, according to the state, and it's Muslim. So it's excluded in two different kind of ways. It's excluded because of a politics of kind of anti-Muslim politics at the state level in Mumbai, and it's excluded also because it is apparently on illegal land. So that means that there's very little state provision of toilets in the neighbourhoods. There's free public toilet blocks and there's free private toilet blocks for the population, which is about 1 seat for 260 people. So you can imagine the queues in the morning and in the evening. One of the private toilet blocks in Rafinagar decided to put its prices up from 1 rupee per use to 2 rupees. So whenever you wanted to use a toilet, you had to pay 2 rupees, not 1. Which is a big problem when you, for example, the kids have diarrhea or you're ill, which is frequent, because it costs quite a lot of money to go to a toilet that frequently. So what do you do in a context when you're illegal? Well, you go to the local political party office, and of course that's not represented by the Shiv Sena, because the Shiv Sena don't represent this area, and so the political party can only do so much for you. Or you go to the local NGOs, but of course the local NGOs can only do so much as well. So the big question then becomes, what do you do politically to get, because a lot of the women in this neighbourhood were saying, well, if you can't use the toilets, if you can't afford to pay for it, what are you going to do? Obviously you use open space in different kinds of ways. But what the women decided to do, in this case, was they decided that they would use the area around the toilet as a toilet. So this was the open ground around the toilet, they started to defecate and urinate in groups around that land, to pressure the private toilet caretaker to reduce the price back to 1 rupee. So here was a politics of the last resort. Here was a politics of using your body, of literally shitting in your own backyard to get something done. It was a politics of desperation. It was not a social movement, it was not a radical change. This was a moment of temporary change through a collective that was organised temporarily in order to effect some kind of change. So this is a metabolic urbanism then cast aside. It's a form of provision of sanitation which is a form of sanitation which is off the map of the city and indeed of a lot of urban theory. Now if we compare that to Kotwadi, we see a different kind of metabolic urbanism. So let's take the example of this toilet block here. This is a toilet block run by an NGO in Kotwadi through the support of the state party, the Shiv Sena that I mentioned. Now, this NGO that runs this, Charitana Purana Mandal, it is an excellent NGO, an exciting NGO. But it's interesting to think about the kinds of politics that are going on here. Because this neighbourhood has the support of the Shiv Sena, the things that it's capable to do, the things the residents are capable to do, are different from the things they can do in Rafinagar. The options available are different. So what this NGO did is they built this toilet block. But it's not just a toilet block. Upstairs, there's a community centre. It's also used as a dance hall. There's a sports centre. There's now plans to build a biogas plant where you're converting shit into energy for cooking and other activities in the neighbourhood. So in a sense, this toilet was taking waste and trying to do something positive with it, turning waste into value. economic and social value of different kinds. And it was celebrated in the local media, it was celebrated by the multiple awards that it's received, it was celebrated by many journalists and international NGOs and policymakers and academics who go and visit it and talk about it and so on. So it's entered a circuit of entrepreneurial urbanism. And in a sense, its success is predicated precisely on its capacity to enter into a broader logic of how the city should develop. This, in other words, is sanitised sanitation. It's slum sanitation done as it should be done. It's people pulling themselves up by their bootstraps and performing sanitation on their own, right? It's a mile away, literally a mile away, geographically, but hundreds of miles away from Rafinagar. You know, it's actually, Rafinagar is the unsanitised version of sanitation. This is the form of entrepreneurialism that the state doesn't want to celebrate. But here in Kotwadi we have a form of non-antagonistic politics which is available to the residents there because of the support of the Shiv Sena for this neighbourhood. So these two different moments, and there's lots of other ways of talking about the politics of sanitation in these two neighbourhoods, presents a question. How do we think about everyday urban constitution of sanitation? How do we think about that as a kind of politics? How do we think about its relationship to how we understand the urban political? What is this comparison between these two moments in Rafinagar and Kotwadi tell us, inform us about the nature of what we call the urban political? And I think this is perhaps one of the most important questions for what is often called post-colonial urbanism. Now, so one way to read this is to say, well, what you have here is radical spatial differentiation, right? Even within one city, a few miles from each other, you have the differentiation of politics to such an extent that there is no universal to the political, right? These are two different forms of urban politics. There's no such thing as a uniform or a universal that we can identify here linked to the political. Or you say, well, actually, that's to reduce the political to the empirical. Right, that's an a-theoretical definition of the political. That emerges from everyday life, and that's not the right way to identify the political. So what you do instead is you identify the political as a universal of some sort. So you might say, well, the answer here is clearly, for example, a kind of return to a modernist universalism. So you say, well, what the state should be doing is providing sanitation regardless of legality, regardless of ethnicity, to every neighbourhood in the city, Rafinagar included. And everybody in this room would, of course, support such a politics. But how does that kind of politics stand up against a situation where the state is actively hostile to a neighbourhood like Rafinagar? If you have a state which behaves like a bulldozer to a neighbourhood like Rafinagar, what kind of opportunities are there to hold it to account when you use that kind of politics of universalism? So there's a question here then about a universalist politics and its relation to radical spatial differentiation and the links between them. Okay, in other words, what is the role of everyday differential ways of making urban life, even within one city, for how we render political transformation? This is in part about how we detect the idea of urban possibility, more generally. And in the literature on informal settlements, we just heard a little bit about this, there's different ways of doing that. But broadly speaking, the urban possible is identified in two broad ways in literature on informal settlements. Firstly, in relation to sustainability, and secondly, in relation to politics. Sustainability as sustaining life itself. So I've talked a little bit about politics, but if we think about this in more detail, what's very clear, I think, in a lot of the literature on informal settlements is that flexibility, or flexible urbanism, to use a term of this conference, is often read as the condition of sustaining slum life, as a way in which slums persist in some kind of way. So there's various examples of that. Philip de Bock has talked about improvisation as the field of the possible, where residents have to deal with fragments of infrastructure and fill in the gaps. Adam Simone and Edgar Pieterse have talked about incrementalism, where you have to learn how to build your own infrastructures, and then Edgar Pieterse talks about how that enters into the constitution of social movements and becomes radicalised. Others have described it in different ways. I don't have time to go into these. But most of these points indicates that there's a need to combine a focus on the everyday and spatial differentiation with something else. In other words, to go beyond simply describing how the everyday provides an image of how the political works, to then widen the field of possibility by bringing in some kind of critical theoretical perspective, right? I don't have time to go into examples of that, but we might think of, say, Chatterjee's Political Society there. So, to supplement our understanding of everyday life in order to get to a more radical disclosure of the political and its possibilities. But I think what's key here is that sometimes the lessons of everyday differentiation are then lost, and it's very important not to lose that. So, the way in which I'm trying to keep a hold of differentiation between Coatwaddy and Rathnagar, but also within those neighbourhoods, is through trying to think more about this notion of the everyday and what it is. And I'm thinking about it in three broad ways. Firstly, in relation to rhythms and moments, that's kind of derived from a broadly Lefebvrean notion of the everyday. Second, in relation to radical spatial differentiation. And thirdly, in relation to both content, the day-to-day of how we get things done, and constitutive practices, the practices which produce the conditions through which everyday life takes place. Now, these operate in different ways, and I think there's a so what question in relation to that, which I'll come to. Let's think about rhythm. So we might think, for example, about state policy. Because of the Shiv Sena links in Coatwaddy, there are elections of election cycles where people get services like toilet blocks in return for votes. So we might think of more daily rhythms of patronage where people get their toilet blocks maintained in return for loyalty to the Shiv Sena, which works more in Coatwaddy than in Rathnagar. We might think of annual rhythms of producing high-end latrines, because in Rathnagar there is very little state presence in formal terms. People have to build their own toilets, and they do it in an annual rhythm, usually before the monsoon, to give some kind of toilet access before the monsoon. And we can think about the rhythms of individuals, people like Samira and Farida, who have their own sanitation narratives, if you like, for how they make sanitation on a day-to-day life, which is quite different depending on the individuals. Unfortunately, I don't have time to talk about this, but there's interesting differences here at the individual level, which are important. And there's metabolic rhythms, for example, in relation to illness and disease, which are often difficult to detect, but also in relation to something like open defecation, right? So, for instance, this is Rathnagar. The children will use this area as a toilet, the men will use the main roads, the women will use the garbage ground as a toilet, and they'll go in groups. So there's a kind of metabolic tacit geography which has a rhythm, a day-to-day rhythm. And then there's moments that disrupt it, moments like this, when Rathnagar had all of its water pipes destroyed in one day as a reaction to a weak monsoon, which then creates a whole bunch of new geographies for how you organise sanitation and water. Well, the reason I put this up is because the comparison indicates between Rathnagar and Coatwaddy quite different strategies through which the everyday is constituted, right? So patronage matters more in Coatwaddy than it does in Rathnagar. Open defecation matters more in Rathnagar than it does in Coatwaddy. It matters in both neighbourhoods, but I'm talking about the general kind of level. Self-managed systems such as high-end latrines and other systems matter more than in Rathnagar and Coatwaddy. Now, I think the reason that there's a so what question here is because this comparison is important for understanding a variety of things. What I'm trying to do in this research project is compare the everyday life of different neighbourhoods in the one city. Now, what that reveals in relation to sanitation, what that reveals is something radically different about what this thing called sanitation is. Sanitation is a multiple, constantly expanding process which enrolls different relations in different places. It's not the same thing. It is a qualitatively different thing in Rathnagar than it is in Coatwaddy. I think that's very important for theorising any kind of domain of urban life. And this is within one city. What everyday life in Mumbai is also is read in different ways when you chart it through these two different neighbourhoods. The implications for policy or civil society groups are quite starkly different in both neighbourhoods. So, indeed, is how we understand this thing called the urban political. And finally, the question of critical political change needs to then address the question of how you build a general set of recommendations for change against the radical differentiation of everyday life. How do you marry them two together? And the movement, the right to pee, I can talk about later. It's very interesting. So, I'm finishing up now. It means that the tendency to separate these two things, politics and sustaining life, is a mistake. And I think this is made a lot, this separation in the literature. There's a lot of a lot of critical urban debate tends to say, well, that's just about making life, that's just about improvisation, it's not politics. Actually, what I'm trying to say is that looking in detail at forms of improvisation within a city over the everyday timescale reveals something important about the political. But of course it's important to connect that then to the critical theoretical debates that we're all involved in. And finally, in conclusion, before I get thrown off the stage, this is what I'm trying to say in short. And I'm suggesting that comparison at the neighbourhood level is useful here within the same city. I think there's a bunch of reasons about a bunch of histories that we need to think about here in relation to the everyday, which I've not really mentioned. But also to be mindful of the way in which the everyday is often presented as a kind of residual category to the question of critical political change, rather than an active site through which political change happens, despite this long history of critical debate around these terms. And I think there's various reasons for that, which are to do with causality and explanation, and I don't have time to talk about any of that. So thank you for listening, and I'll get off the stage. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think the kind of post-lunchtime sessions are not fair on either the presenters or the discussants, because they keep from falling asleep after lunch. Very interesting presentations, and I'm sure there was a lot more that you could have said. The time constraints of 15 minutes didn't allow that. I just want to pick up a couple of general points. And the first one is to do with this notion of the everyday life. Yeah? And to what extent the everyday life is mundane, carries on from an outsider's perspective, compared to the everyday life of the individuals living those lives. So for example, the action of shitting around a toilet to bring down the price of the access to the toilet, once that battle is won, there's another battle I'm sure to be faced. So this whole notion of constant change. And this thought came to me after having read two recent books, one by Catherine Boo, Behind the Beautifuls Forever. This is a kind of a real-life study of life in a Mumbai slum and the kind of challenges on a daily basis. Very, very, very positive, very kind of provocative book in terms of its thoughts. And the second one is the one by Arvind Adiga, The Last Man in the Tower, the whole notion of developers and the kind of threats people face. And that, I think, portrays the notion of everyday life from the perspective of those who live in these sites as being very different to how we as researchers might actually experience that notion of the everyday. And therefore this question about how the everyday also then becomes politicized is interesting. And I use the word politicized here with an inverted quotations. It's not the formal political process of whether a particular political party is supportive of what you're doing or hindering what you're doing, but it's this negotiation, the kind of things that people go through. So these 2 points about the notion of the everyday life being kind of multifaceted, seen differently by people who actually witness everyday life, and the politicized nature, I think then plays out into the three presentations we heard. In terms of the whole question of international migration, the work that Ben presented, the notion of comparing these multiple sites and looking at the kind of notion of perceived versus real claims made by these migrants vis-a-vis the state. So we talked about housing, to what extent that plays out in terms of housing benefits in the UK as compared to somewhere like Istanbul where that actually doesn't exist. So I think those differences are quite important. The same kind of differentiation also comes through when one talks about migration within national boundaries. New forms of migration, forced labor contracts in construction, domestic worker chain migration, these kind of forms of migration also create other kinds of tensions within the neighborhood and within communities. And at the same time as perhaps creating those tensions, it also creates other forms of coming together and of support. So I think this kind of tension between what people say as a group about xenophobic feelings, for example, and how they individually kind of carry through daily life is a useful one to look at. So my question would be that kind of comparative one, looking at various levels of the economic, the social, the political, how these play out differently in that area. The issue around Ashwayat, very interesting, because if I compare that with India, where this kind of quasi-legal development of land, where agricultural land is sold, And the sale of agricultural land is legal. One can buy and sell land. But the conversion of agricultural land to housing use becomes problematic. And what's happened in India, it's not these kind of large walk-up tenements that you showed, Ahmed. It's individuals who buy land and then build housing. And the developers who lay these plots out are now becoming so astute that they're actually following government guidelines. So it's easy to actually regularize these settlements afterwards, and it becomes an extra selling point. Whereas in your case of Cairo, is much more a developer-led, where somebody is actually building that entire block and then selling it or renting it out. And to what extent that falls within the legal parameters of acceptance at a later stage, to what extent it's actually meeting the demand that otherwise the state is not able to meet, because there are people living in those areas. So I think that was a very interesting one, looking at the developer-led rather than the individual-led conversion of that land. And finally, coming to the whole issue around sanitation. This is very important, and I think the fact that a lot of people recognize the need to have potable water, boil water and drink it, the whole question around sanitation and its impacts on health are still not understood very well. So this whole notion of total community-led sanitation, how that feeds in. Perhaps in Mumbai, Colin, the work of NGOs like Spark and their notions of having toilets that are geared towards children and women as compared to men, and how that whole thing plays out. And there's a huge gender dimension here if one is defecating in the open, and yes, very clear out in this point. So the question whether these forms of resistance, the forms of activism are determined by the constraints or the lack of constraints in terms of political support is, I think, quite important. And to what extent processes like the toilet you showed, where there is a community space on top or the caretakers living to actually maintain the toilet, becomes then institutionalized, and why doesn't it get scaled up? And I think that's a big question to ask from these examples. Okay, thank you very much. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Sunil.
I just would like to explain a little bit about the difference between slums and shwayat. Shwayat is a local terminology. We use it in Egypt. That people who build in agricultural land, they have some sort of legality, land tenure security, but their construction process is illegal. So there is a combination between legality and illegality. And I think this is a unique phenomenon in Egypt, that the government can't demolish all of our shwayat. They try to find a solution to upgrade this large area of shwayat all over Egyptian cities. As I mentioned, that nearly 50% of housing production during the last 30 years is a shwayat. So you can imagine how much is it. In Cairo city, as you notice, that is all the western sector of Cairo is full of shwayat. I've got a slide, but I didn't show it to you. There is a difference between, for example, Muhandisin area in Cairo. There is a big difference between Muhandisin area for elite of the society, and adjacent to it directly, Bulaq al-Taqoo. Bulaq al-Taqoo, it is for the poorest of the poor. Bulaq al-Taqoo accommodated at least 1 million persons. We're talking about Cairo as 20 million persons living on it. So we've got a huge amount of shwayat, but we couldn't find a way to solve it since, long time ago. Not these days, no, since a long time ago. I think if we can give or guide the urban poor to develop an area that the government would like to see developed, we can tackle a part of shwayat problem in Egypt or elsewhere in third world countries. That is all what I say. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. Just very briefly, I suppose. Thank you for the comments, Sunil. I suppose, you've raised the broader question of how we represent the everyday, and I think that's a very important question. And I think that there's a curious kind of sort of rupture between the rich texture of everyday life and the process of writing about it in academic scholarship, and that kind of shift from the from the field to the conference venue or the academic paper, I think is one which is very important for us to reflect on. And I mean, Philip Duboc, who I mentioned, for example, has made very powerful films about everyday life in places like Kinshasa, which give you a flavour of things in a way which perhaps you don't get in academic presentations and papers. So I think there's something important there about what is lost in the translation from the field to the written word or spoken word when you're talking about something like the everyday. And I think this question of differentiation is very much central to that challenge. The question just quickly on Spark. Spark is a very dominant NGO and was given, I didn't mention this, but was given the largest disbursement of development funds in Indian history when it got the project, when it got the contract from the World Bank to build toilets in Mumbai. But the problem was that what they lost was what they used to be good at. And what they used to be good at was precisely everyday life. They used to know how settlements worked. They used to know how they were differentiated. They used to know the differences between different slums. And when they got the contract, they became another contractor. They became an organic version of the state, effectively. And I think there's an important lesson there about the way in which social movements and NGOs, remain with a kind of strong geographical and everyday kind of approach to their work. One thing I'll just add quickly was that the kind of illegality thing, there is a connection to India insofar as Raf Nagar, I think I mentioned this to Charlotte's probably thinking she's heard this before, I spoke to her on Tuesday about this, but the toilet block that was built recently in Raf Nagar on the edge of the city, on the edge of the neighbourhood, is illegal according to the municipality because it's an illegal neighbourhood, but was built via state funds from the state of Maharashtra. And the welfare funds of the state politician can be used in illegal areas. So the toilet block is now technically illegal according to the municipality who's threatening to demolish it, but legal according to the state government who's insisting the municipality keep it there and maintain it. So there's interesting overlapping legal kind of geographies that kind of get mixed up. It's this stuff which would be interesting to think more about in relation to everyday sort of politics. Anyway, that was it. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Strange coincidence, I just finished Catherine Boo's book and I've just started Last Man in the Tower, which was given to me by a sociologist because I told him the story of another ethnographic project I was involved in Deptford, in Lewisham, which followed a resident who was the last man in the tower who refused to move a tower that was moved from a tower that was formerly a municipal block that was sold to private developers, and who kind of single-handedly held up a multi-million-pound kind of development for several months. I think Joe will be familiar with that story. But and I think that the kind of discourse, the story that this guy that led to Last Man in the Tower in Deptford kind of held on to was the idea of a kind of municipal social democratic state which ought to provide council housing. And I guess the availability or not of that sort of discourse, I guess to confirm what you're saying, is a huge kind of determining factor if we're looking at kind of comparative urban politics, those kind of expectations on what the state does or doesn't do, which makes Britain very different from Greece, very different from Mumbai's kind of, makes a huge difference. And I guess just to echo Colin's point, that by tracking these particular cases, we can see those differences very clearly.
Thank you, Ben. The floor is now open for questions and comments from the audience. I see a few hands already, so we'll start right here. Sorry. This gentleman.
First question for Dr. Ahmed. I've read recently 2 famous eviction cases have been halted, and another discussion yesterday was talking about it as well, Corsair Island and Durham. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about why you think they've been stopped. They've been kind of constantly under threat, and finally it seems like these 10-year struggles are over, and it coincides quite well with what's happened in July, August. And then the second question is for Colin. Just wondering, this last comment you made about the kind of scalar legal-illegal paradox. I'm just wondering if that opens up any opportunities, that kind of contradiction in the state itself. at different scales, and if that somehow informs the rhythms of everyday life, if they inhabit that kind of gap somehow, or if that becomes an opportunity somehow, that seeming restriction becomes a kind of open space. Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes. Nick, talking about RWA, it is close to Taqoo and Muhandisin area. Am I right? Raml Pura. It is close to it. It started before January Revolution, and they started to set up a new project to demolish all the area and replace them to another location. They found a lot of argument from the citizen itself. It's just it was before January, it was in 2010, December 2010. After the revolution, they stopped everything. Nobody can take a decision since the January 2011 until now. They can't move any person from its own location. Even people who build an agricultural land now, they can demolish it. All planning policy now stopped for 2 or 3 years. That for political and social reasons, because the government has no finance to replace people and build new houses and infrastructure and job opportunities and so on. They stop everything now since the January 2011. And not only there's different. There was a scheme in Hagana in Haggana, Haggana as well. They stopped this scheme as well. Manshiat Nasser started with Suzanne Mubarak before the January 2011 and stopped after that. Every planning schemes in Egypt has been stopped. That's for political and social reasons. That's the main reason.
Thank you. I think there is opportunities in that gap of these kind of overlaid geographies of legality and illegality, and that was expressed, for example, in how the community was able to get, or certain people within the community were able to get that toilet built. Of course, most infrastructure in Rafinagar is attained necessarily through a kind of below the radar sort of means, because it's an illegal neighbourhood, and although sometimes state officials are involved in that. Water is a good example. The spaghetti pipes I showed, many of those water pipes would have been attained so-called illegally through paying through various middlemen and landowners to get access to it. But I think the gap of opportunity is actually much more about intangible stuff. It's much more about things like rumour. So for instance, there's a great paper by Lisa Bjorkman, who did a brilliant ethnography of water in a neighbourhood not very far away from Rafinagar, in which she showed that actually the way in which people identify new opportunities in relation to infrastructures and services is because they hear on the grapevine, rumours that down the street there's a resident who's got a sudden increase in water pressure, and that might be because the water pressure on a different pipe somewhere else has been cut, creating new geographies of pressure in the neighbourhood, and that this resident has a bigger supply which they're now selling for slightly less money than someone else down the street. That person down the street gets wind of it and increases the price, and then or drops their price. So you kind of have this constant movement through which rumour and kind of keeping your ear to the ground and using the networks you have constitute infrastructure. And they constitute infrastructure in a way which is obviously radically different from how water supply is constituted in the UK or somewhere else like that, but also in a way which reveals the need for networks, social networks, around these material infrastructures. And I think those kind of gaps actually are often the ones that people seek to exploit, far more than these legal gaps, which may or may not be important, which are more sporadic.
We have a few more questions. Michael. Oh, could we pass the microphone? Thank you.
It's a comment and then a question for all three speakers really. And the comment is was prompted by Colin's fascinating contribution, but as he was speaking, I was actually thinking that if you go back to, believe it or not, I mean, to early 19th century England, as I'm sure you're aware, that the hottest political committee of the local councils tended to be the sanitation committee. And I suppose that kind of speaks partly in obvious ways to your paper, but also all three papers, in a sense, raise questions about how we think about the city as a commons. And it's a commons that either needs migrants but refuses to recognise their needs, or needs health but refuses to recognise the consequences, or needs a population but doesn't understand how to accommodate it. So this notion of the commons clearly can be seen in many different ways, but I mean sometimes in ways that are similar in a manner that we don't always realise. So when Hart and Negri talk about the commons disturbing the distinction between the public and the private, they're talking in a language that is not that different from an economic understanding of the externalities of migration or sanitation or public housing in some ways. So there seems to me something both across the papers about how we conceptualize the city as a public good, as a commons, or languages related to those terms. But also the question then to all three speakers, which I suppose is interesting, is that given that was the context, one of the ways in which the commons is regulated is through property rights. But interestingly, I guess none of the three speakers touched on property rights. So I guess the direct question would be how if you think about property rights, it inflects what each of you are saying analytically in terms of what is, but I suppose also how it might inflect it normatively in terms of what might be or what should be in the city that is to come, the city of the future.
Sure.
Yeah, okay, I will pick up the last point. Property rights in Egypt is very complicated, especially in Islamic countries. As you might know, we've got a system called Waqf system, Waqf Ahli and Waqf Khali, and there is a difference between both of them. That's one type. But we've got a full ownership. We've got full ownership without 10-year security. We've got de facto ownership. We've got de jure ownership. We've got squatting. Each type of property right has many problems to follow it. It is another paper to do it. But you can go back to Jeffrey Bain book. It was published in early 2004, Land Right and Innovation. He just mentioned this differences there. But I would like to mention for Nick, for his previous questions about why a certain scheme doesn't implement it on the ground. To be quite honest, we've got an association called the Informal Settlement Facility Fund. This is established in 2008 during the Mubarak era, and allocated around £500 million for upgrading informal areas on cost-benefit, cost-recovery basis. The 500 million pound has been distributed in different Egyptian cities, but none project has been implemented on the ground. I've got a project in Tanta City, my own city. It is allocated around 35 million pounds to upgrade it. We trying to do it on the ground since 4 years, but we didn't succeed to implement this project. People behavior inside informal area, they would like to have more money, more real estate for the benefit for themselves, not for the benefit of the rest of the society. So we've got different experience, but we didn't succeed in any experience at all in Egypt, unless the Hacker project in the Ismailia city. It was back 1977. Maybe some of you heard about it. It has Aga Khan Award in 1982, and it did succeed in meeting the urban boom needs. That is the only project we can rely on it in Egypt. But I'd like to mention. Thank you.
I guess, well, the quick answer, I guess, is that property rights matter hugely to the types of things I was talking about. I guess one very clear example of that would be some of the struggles around, I guess, social housing in London and the ways in which, on the one hand, I guess the privatisation of social housing through right to buy kind of opens up the council estate, which is seen by many sort of working class established residents as a kind of public, as a kind of commons, and perceive people who are buying or renting kind of the private parts of those estates as kind of encroaching upon the commons in a kind of illegitimate way. So that I guess the commons is often constructed through this kind of idea of insider outsider, which isn't necessarily inclusive and maybe cuts against the kind of leftist sort of discourse of the commons. I guess another example around that would be ways in which I suppose the commons, the enclosure of the commons, as Neil this morning was talking about enclosure in terms of urban extension, but I guess, or extensive urbanism, but I guess the kind of enclosure of the commons in the heart of the city is also an ongoing project. So places, again, social housing that's kind of passing from public ownership into private ownership through various different ways, which make, I guess, claims again on right to belonging harder to make because there's, you know, things are being removed from kind of common ownership into private ownership, or are perceived to be. I'm not sure if there's an answer, but comment.
I think that's a really important question, and actually about the commons, and you're absolutely right in the sense that the commons here, in the context of sanitation, perhaps more than anywhere else, although you could make the case across a variety of sectors, entirely rejects the division of private and public. This is one of the problems of sanitation, of course, is the politics in Mumbai around sanitation is the committing of private acts in public. So the commons, as a form of political alterity, has to be about bypassing some kind of notion of privacy and publicity. And because it's a metabolic process in some ways. So the map of open defecation that I put up is a kind of organisation of the metabolic commons, which is rooted in rhythms of day-to-day life. But when you start to think then of it as a kind of metabolic enclosure or a metabolic commons, the question of the politics of that become quite interesting. So for instance, I mean, let's take those water pipes that I showed that were cut. That kind of moment of water pipes being cut in Rafinagar is also is about a poor monsoon. It's about state management of water. It's about an anti-Muslim politics. It's about various things. But it's also about rural farming in Maharashtra. Insofar as at the same time as families were being denied water in Rafinagar to wash their kids and hydrate themselves, at the same time that was happening, water was being bypassed through subsistence farming in rural Maharashtra in order to keep providing the very powerful sugar barons of rural Maharashtra, who feed one of the fastest growing industries in India, the bottled water industry, which is putting bottles of Pepsi and water onto the tables of middle class Mumbaikas. So the state, in other words, is making a very clear political choice, which is both rural and urban, to disqualify the illegal Muslim poor in Rafinagar and subsistence farmers. This was a time when subsistence farmers, there was a massive increase in suicides. So the question of the commons then is about following the metabolic process of what's going on here. It takes you to rural farming, as well as it takes you to the politics of global water industries and the slums of Rafinagar, which means, I think, that one of the interesting questions as well, because a lot of the slum politics in Mumbai gets refracted through housing tenure, which is important, but clearly there is, if you bring in rural farming, if you see it as a metabolic commons, then the solutions have to involve an urban and rural kind of politics. So there's an interesting way in which taking the commons kind of as a metabolic commons shifts the geographies of it's not about rights to the city anymore, it's about the rights to the production of life itself, in a certain sense. But housing, of course, is crucial in relation to this, and there's a big debate in India right now about this, because the government is embarked on a massive campaign of security of tenure, which flies in the face of all the global evidence about security of tenure, which is that it usually doesn't work, because it creates markets and prices people out. But there is an interesting debate right now in Mumbai, which I'm hoping to follow up on that. But thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to collect the final questions. Sunil wanted to make a point that there was a question at the back, one right here. Anybody else? Okay. So we start with Sunil.
Just a quick comment on the work of Asher Gertner on the politics of sanitation in Delhi. Looking at the High Court judgments from Delhi High Court in the 70s on open defecation. And the aim of those judgments were to ask the local authority why they had failed in the provision of sanitation services to the poor. In the 1990s, the discourse had changed. Because of public interest litigation, the whole discourse changed to the judgments now asking the poor what right they had to be where they were, and therefore defecating in the open. So the nature of discourse with kind of liberalization in India, it also changed the boundaries of this notion of public and private, or the notion of right and wrong, or the notion of who actually should be justifying these outcomes. We just do that work in Delhi.
There's a question right there.
Hello, my name is Dolf Lintro. I'm a fellow at the Institute of Development Studies at Sussex. I had a question actually initially for Colin, but then the first questioner asker sort of raised to the issue. But I'd like to just quickly go back to it, sort of the issue of possibility in a fragmented state. It seemed to me that sort of the examples that you shared sort of suggested sort of quite a sort of a strong sort of dichotomy, where sort of the I think Rafi Naga didn't have access to state institutions or wasn't able to make the political linkages to the state because of some form of, I think sort of in a way, sort of the way which you seem to posit it was like this concentration of political power by the Shiv Sena. Now, is that a bit too black and white? Also, given that sort of a lot of the sort of the theories, some of the theories that you sort of refer to, like Bhatta Chatterjee's work, sort of, he said, you know, these arrangements are always very sort of temporal. They're uncertain. We don't know what's coming out, particularly when tenure is insecure, when it's illegal. So these temporary arrangements sort of, you know, always need to be reproduced. They're always sort of always uncertain. So now, your comment about the rumours, sort of, or as sort of the more everyday, sort of really everyday, if you like, sort of more sort of individual sort of linkages with opportunities suddenly emerging instead of in neighbourhoods. Your example from what was really quite interesting. But I would really like to push a bit on sort of, really aren't there more multiple venues in the state sort of where people do make political claims using various forms of political agency that you highlighted really nicely, I think. And a question to Ahmed, sort of, I was really intrigued sort of by your story about sort of Ash'ariyat, and my question really was sort of, considering sort of the examples given by Colin and also by sort of by Ben, sort of, what are the sort of, through what sort of political mechanisms do people people able to actually sort of, you know, go against sort of the construction sort of regulations? Because you noted sort of 10 years secure, however, actually building these houses is not. And just to go back to Delhi, sort of in Delhi, sort of the same process was happening. Sort of Ash'ariyat wasn't called, but then sort of through Supreme Court intervention, sort of the municipal corporation decided to slam down on the illegal constructions and sort of suddenly raised sort of half the city. So maybe some comments on the politics, the political processes through which Ash'ariyat is produced and reproduced. I find very, very useful. Thank you.
Okay, there was a question right behind you.
Zach Wilcox from the Center for Cities. So we discussed a lot about the everyday challenges in cities, and particularly migrant communities. And as someone who works with practitioners quite a lot, and not to sound too positive or naive, I was wondering if you could talk about any benefits of migrant communities and kind of what Ben referred to as the diversity advantage that you've experienced in cities.
Okay. And we're just going to follow the trajectory. There was a question right there at the back. Don't feel obligated to answer everything.
Yeah, I was struck listening to all of the papers that one of the other things that the Everyday is doing in your papers is also that borderlands between public-private, home, domestic, I think home is sort of, you know, the reproduction of society, etc. But I was interested in how different the people that you're talking about are very undifferentiated in it. So that we just hear about the fact that they live everyday lives in these spaces. And I was wondering, for instance, what kinds of identities mean that people run up against barriers. So, for instance, I was actually thinking of Ione Dutta's work in Delhi. It's becoming a bit of a hot city at this moment. And she writes about people also in informal neighbourhoods who are legal citizens as citizens of India on the one hand, but illegal as residents on the other, and how that impacts on what other kinds of claims they can make. I mean, one of the things she really usefully picks up on is gender. And clearly that's an enormous issue if we're talking about sanitation. It's also, I imagine, plays out, I don't know the sort of Kyrene, the Alexandrian setting so much, but I'm sure it plays out there as well. And I'm quite certain it has implications for migrants in different areas as well. So I wondered what you thought about thinking about the everyday as slightly more that borderlands between public and private, and who can move through and between and across those spaces, and what kinds of identities are, or what kinds of facets of their sort of personhood are implicated in those kinds of movements.
Okay. I think there was a question in this area. No? Okay.
Yes.
The final one is yours.
Yeah. Nikolai Bodorev, University of Birmingham. I have a technical question to Colin about toilets. Where is the sludge discharged, and what is the financial arrangement for that? Thank you.
Okay. So the speakers now have a chance to answer any or all of these questions.
Just briefly, that I will answer why people act illegally. Why people in Egypt would like to act illegally. I think the government will force the urban pool to act illegally because we've got different building and planning laws. Prevent people to go through a legal way. For example, we've got urban project, general search, urban plans for around 2,026 Egyptian cities, and we've done it. But the next step after these plans, we have to carry out something called detailed plan for extension areas. And even if we finish this second step, we'll face main important point within detailed plan for extension area as the following step of general structure urban plans. There's something called land subdivision project. Land subdivision project assumes that all land in Egypt is officially registered. But the fact is, in reality, between 80 to 90% of land in Egypt is has no official document as land ownership documentation. So we stick with the third step of the project. So none of the 226 plans that being carried out, been implemented on the ground. The problem is that the government will force people to act illegally by one or another, and also to go through legal procedures. It costs a lot of money, and it takes a long time to go through legal ways. For example, the first step to get legal license, building license, you have to apply for something called building certificate. To do that, it might take 2 years, at least 2 years or more than 2 years. So nobody can wait for 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 years to get the first step to apply for building license. And that we are trying to convince the decision maker to change some decrees of building and the planning law number 119 for 2008. And we are working on it nowadays to try to facilitate the different procedure and eliminate time consuming to apply for building license. I think that is the main point, that we have to simplify the law, the building law, to attract people to go through formality, not so informality.
I know we've run out of time, so in a sense, I think I've been looking at my notes here and trying to figure out if any of them were short answers and they're not. So I'm going to just say that thank you for the. I mean, I think all the questions I got were around context in particular. I mean, I suppose one of the things we're doing, is to try to link the experience of sanitation in the papers we're working on to intersectionality of different sorts. So it is absolutely always about gender, and the way in which gender intersects with class and ethnicity is vital. So when the water pipes were cut, age as well, and when the water pipe was cut in Rafinagar, that was very, very clear. You know, a whole bunch of intersections became very important as to who coped and how they coped, and how and also how some people supported one another and other people exploited one another in terms of using their access to resources at a critical time, and the role of the state within that was very important. This also opens up what I think Dolph was saying about other ways in which people interact with the state, and in moments of crisis that can be very clear, especially low-level state officials, and the way in which water was being policed, for example, and the links to sanitation. So all I want to say really is that I think this raises a broader point about what I was trying to say in my presentation, which is about radical differentiation, this idea of you know, the kind of when you look at the everyday, the wealth of difference and specificity that reveals within a neighbourhoods, between neighbourhoods, within a city, I think is a serious challenge to urban critical studies. The question for us is how we deal with some of those old-fashioned questions, like the links between generality and specificity. When we explain urban change, what are the coordinates through which we identify the key causal elements of change, and how do we deal with spatial variation? And I think some of those old questions are starting to resurface a little bit, and I think it's important that we reflect on it. So that's all I'll say. It comes out, I think, of a number of the questions. But thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. I'm not sure if I heard the question over here correctly, but I think it's around kind of positive examples of migrant associations, and for me, one of the most interesting, very recent mobilisations of kind of migrant associations in London, in one of the areas I've been working, Elephant and Castle. Last week there was anti-raids mobilisations, kind of border force raids on workplaces, kind of to deport illegal people, which were resisted in Elephant and Castle mainly by very politicised Latin American workers, who include undocumented people, just kind of who've been involved partly through church-based organisations in things like the Strangers and Citizens Movement for Regularisation. But there's also been two other recent anti-raids mobilisations in West London, an area with a lot of Punjabi, other South Asian settlement, and these mobilisations have been interestingly kind of women-led, so groups like South Black Sisters, feminist organisation, have kind of been leading them. This week in Chinatown in London, there was a kind of mobilisation against raids, which in contrast was almost 100% male, and was very interestingly organised by both restaurant workers and restaurant owners. And the restaurant owners are very much plugged into some of the kind of networks of patronage that kind of echo, I guess, the sort of Shiv Sena type politics of kind of patronage and negotiation with the state. And there's kind of, I guess that's, within those three mobilisations, there's just a huge kind of range of different types of associationism, and gender kind of plays kind of significant difference in all of them.
Well, thank you, Ben. We are going to bring this session to a close. There is coffee and tea outside. We're supposed to reconvene at 4 p.m. for the last session of the day, but before we go, please join me in thanking the speakers and the discussants for an excellent session.